Thank you, Mr. Sani, and a very good morning to all of you, and thank you for joining us today for today's webinar on education and employability. On behalf of Dr. Sangeeta Pant, Dean, Chitkara College of Education, Chitkara University, I, Dr. Vani Parvez, extend a very warm welcome to all the participants and extend a special welcome to our keynote orator for today's webinar, Professor Michele Simons. I would also like to extend my gratitude to Ms. Namrata, Senior Management, Recruitment and Operations South Asia, Western Sydney International for her continued support and coordination to make this event happen. Gratitude to Mr. Sanjeev Sani and the entire team of Office of International Affairs for their never-ending efforts and continuous support rendered for organizing this event. Let me introduce to all of you our valuable collaboration with Western Sydney University, Australia. We have been having regular visits by Western Sydney University faculties from all disciplines to both our campuses, Punjab and Himachal Pradesh. We have hosted their students for internship with our startup school pad in 2019 under the new Colombo Plan, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade Plan. Hosted 5 students in internship and 2 students in semester exchange. Hosted their faculty in our Global Week, Professor Simi Bajaj and Professor Anna Hall. Articulation agreements with WSU in all disciplines of engineering. At present, we have our students studying at Western Sydney University under the Articulation Agreement. Recently, 2 of our alumni from Punjab campus and Himachal Pradesh campus each have received 50% VC scholarship for doing their masters from Western Sydney University. Online sessions from faculties and panel discussions to promote transnational education. Before we take forward, let me share a brief about the speaker for today. Professor Michele Simons, Dean, School of Education. She has an extensive experience in supporting learning in the fields of adult education, vocational education, workplace learning, and secondary teacher education programs. She brings a wealth of knowledge in the design and development of programs conducive to student learning at both undergraduate and postgraduate levels. Professor Simons is a well-respected researcher, having won a number of nationally competitive grants from Australian Research Council and the National Vocational Education and Training Research and Evaluation Program. She is a part of the team of researchers who won funding from the most recent round of ARC linkage grants for a project examining the role that school principals play in retaining the best teacher. So that was a brief about our speaker. And now let me update you that we are also holding this webinar under our EDUREFORM project, co-financed by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union, which aims to mitigate the impact of fourth industrial revolution on Indian society through an education reform for future and in-service school teachers. Before we invite the resource person for today's webinar, I would now like to hand over to Ms. Celia and Ms. Alda to brief us about EDUREFORM project. Over to you, Celia and Alda now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Vani. So as you can see, we are myself, Alda, and Celia. We're both project managers at the EDUREFORM project. It is a project coordinated by the Chitkara University. It's a 3-year project co-funded by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union. It consists of 11 partners, Indian as well as European. As you can see, the name of our partners, of 4 Indian universities, 4 European universities, 2 schools, secondary schools, and 1 small medium enterprise. As Ms. Vani explained, this project, the aim is to mitigate the impact of the fourth industrial revolution on the Indian society, and this is also one of the main reasons why we are in this webinar, because we are we think that this our project is also, it is related to the talk that Dr. Simon will have today. So without, but Celia will talk briefly what the main goal of our project is, and then we will move on to the lecture.
Okay, so what is our objective at EDUREFORM? So as Alda mentioned, the fourth industrial revolution is essential to our project. What is the fourth industrial revolution? So it's a revolution that is bringing transformative changes in the way we live, we work, and are governed. How? So this is through artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, quantum computing, and many other things that you might be aware of. And now more than ever, it is important to move from our current approach in education that is heavily theoretical to a more practical and analytical education. We don't need to give students answers to remember and memorize. They should rather be able to solve problems. So at EDUREFORM, we want to create national best practices to support the Indian authorities to cope with these changes. We will empower teachers to train students to think outside the box, to analyze today's problems, so that they are fit to embrace the technological changes that are happening in our societies. You can see in the next slide our EDUREFORM's social media accounts. So I encourage you to follow us if you want to know more about our project. We are on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn. You can also email us any question you might have. So I don't want to take up too much time because we have a great speaker joining us today. I just want to highlight that the challenges that the education system is facing currently, those will never be solved by institutions acting unilaterally. We need effective partnerships that make us stronger and more resilient to overcome the obstacles ahead of us. And I think that our speaker today will heavily emphasize on this.
So this is exactly what Celia mentioned. This is what our guest lecturer will be speaking about today. So without taking any further time, I will give the floor to Dr. Simons.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I will just organise to share my screen. So, hopefully everyone can see that. So thank you, everyone. And I'm deeply honoured to be asked today to share some ideas with you about some thinking that I have been doing for a very long time, but also the topic of partnerships, which is deeply, deeply important to the School of Education, where I currently work with my colleagues at Western Sydney University. So I want to reflect on partnerships and on employability and how we particularly might think about the ways in which partnerships can act as a vehicle to assist our students to develop the knowledge and skills and dispositions that they need to thrive, which includes being engaged in some form of employment. And that necessarily means building their employability. In all of my work as an educator, partnerships have been really, really important. They've provided the vehicle for me to do a variety of work and to connect with a variety of different types of learners. And I've done some interesting research on the nature of those partnerships. What does it take to have the sorts of partnerships that actually help us to do the sort of work we want to do? And I think it's really important that we ask questions about the partnerships, because so often we're really interested in the project, what we're doing. And in actual fact, what we need to think about is, well, is this partnership that we have fit for purpose? One of the things I often do is I go into many schools and I ask them to tell me a list of all of the partners that the school works with. And they will write pages. They will have 50, 60, 100 partners. And then I will say, how many of these have you talked to in the last week, or in the last month, or in the last year? And what we actually find out is that there's a lot of resources not being spent wisely on those partnerships that are best going to help schools or these organisations do the job that they need to do. And so I want to focus on partnerships that actually are going to help us drive employability. So just so that we're clear, I thought I'd start by just saying what I understand employability to mean. So in the context of my university, Western Sydney, we talk about employability in this sort of way. It's skills, understanding and personal attributes that are linked to employment, to getting a job, to moving within jobs. For school leavers, often it can be about getting themselves ready to be in the workforce. And so it's not just about skills and knowledge, it's about dispositions. And often the sorts of partnerships that help us to create employability require schools and universities to work beyond their boundaries, to partner with industries. And I often talk about this idea of taking learning to work. Or we can also do it the other way, where we bring work to learning. So what we do is our institutions become permeable, and we can invite industries into our universities and classrooms just as much as we can go out to university, go outside and engage with people from outside. And at Western Sydney University and in many universities, they will have thought about how this impacts on curriculum and pedagogy, on teaching and learning. And at Western Sydney University, we have this approach called partnership pedagogy. And what partnership pedagogy is exactly as it sounds. It's about forming partnerships where we actually co-create curriculum with our partners. We co-design, we co-develop, we co-deliver, and we co-credential and co-assess any elements of our curriculum. So it can be part of a subject. It can be a whole unit. It can be a sequence of learning for, say, the professional development of teachers. And this type of partnership pedagogy can include a lot of traditional elements of what we might think about as learning on the job. So it can include internships, placements, cadetships, but it can also include really interesting ways in which we can bring industry into the classroom through the curriculum. And I'm going to talk about an example that we have done in the professional development of teachers, which is where we formed a partnership with a major company delivering a significant piece of infrastructure in Western Sydney. They're actually building a light rail, and we have partnered with them to do professional learning with teachers to bring work and careers and maths and science into the classroom for children and young people. So we'll talk about that a little bit more, but the idea here is that employability in particular requires us to think about pedagogy and curriculum in particular ways. And the other thing is, obviously, as I've said before, this also rests on a particular understanding of what a partnership is. And as I alluded to in my introduction, often partnerships are something we don't think much about. They're the background to the work that we do. And I think it can sometimes be a challenge to focus on the partnership itself, the challenges and how is it working. It's like trying to understand the anatomy of partnerships. So if you know the meaning of the word anatomy is that sort of a body plan, the anatomy is sort of like the skeleton. And so understanding a partnership is the skeleton, and the project, you put the flesh on the skeleton. But you need to be sure of the foundation of the skeleton that you're building on. So we're interested in these partnerships. So first of all, it's always interesting to think about, well, what do we mean by partnership? It's a word we use all the time. And obviously, as you can imagine, in the academic literature, there's a number of ways of defining them. This is one definition that I really like. So it's a combination of entities coming together into a relationship to address a common aim where they combine resources and competencies. Another definition from the United Kingdom is a little bit more dynamic. It talks about joint working relationships where independent parties, they link together, they cooperate around common goals. But what I think is really important here is it involves movement of all parties. So we come together and we create something new together. We don't partner with you and we take over or we assimilate you into our way of doing things. We actually have an agreement to create something that we both own together. And we actually collaborate across all aspects of that. We don't just bring our partner in the end when we've done all the planning or we've done all the development. We have them with us right from the beginning. And we have a commitment to shared information, shared resources, also sharing the risks and the rewards. So this is a definition that I really like. And often I will ask colleagues that I work with is to pressure test, to say, okay, how many of your partnerships do you think fit this definition? And a lot of them will say, well, sometimes, but not as well as they could be. And so the challenge is to think about, well, how can we build these partnerships that, in fact, embrace some of these dimensions? So just to take this a little bit further, there's a research centre at Deakin University which has spent some time thinking about, well, what are the principles that underpin sustainable partnerships? And I think these are interesting building blocks to reflect on. And as we go through this, it's often, I would invite my colleagues here today to perhaps reflect on partnerships that you have and think about these principles and how they might apply. So let's go through these in just quickly. So the first principle is recognition. This is a principle where each partner understands its own distinctive organisational culture and therefore understands what they can bring to a partnership. So it's like the old adage, you have to know yourself before you can go into a relationship. So as an organisation, how good are we at being a partner? And this is something that my colleagues and I will discuss. How good is the School of Education as a partner? Are we somebody that people will want to, an organisation will want to partner with? Do we understand who we are and what we have to offer? Secondly, this is about being respectful and having a spirit of equity. So when we go into a partnership, we're willing to share and to be generous, to share our knowledge, to share our skills. So we go in with that principle in mind. When we also build partnerships, another building block is this notion of review, being willing to be open and accountable and accessible and proactive in the way in which we are constantly asking questions like, how are we going? How are we travelling? Another building block of good partnerships is resiliency. This is where, we all are very familiar with the concept that partnerships often have to have a leader. The leadership needs to endorse it. It starts at the top. But it's also about this idea of being truthful and honest and having integrity and being sensitive to the people that we're working with and being flexible. So it's about the ethical, the way in which our ethical behaviour as a partner is displayed. We also need to be responsible, and we actually need to accept the responsibility we have for the conduct of a partnership. So what is it that we have to do in order to make the partnership work? Another building block is thinking about rewards. Often rewards may not be equal. Sometimes in a partnership, we might do more than the partner might do and gain more from it. it's not about a zero-sum game and being equal in terms of sharing. It's actually about mutual benefits, you know, and some of those may be monetary and really concrete, but sometimes those benefits are not monetary, and they can be the sort of capital that helps us become better organisations, that builds the capital of the people that are working in our organisation. The building block of resolve is just acknowledging that in all partnerships, we're going to have competing claims, priorities, and there's going to be conflict. Healthy partnerships, there is conflict. And so there's a commitment to actually, to deal with these conflicts, and also to acknowledge when we have conflicts of interest and competing claims, that we're able to put them on the table and deal with them appropriately. And the last two are relevance. This is about how partnership and the work of partnership is really embedded into our core work. In the School of Education, just recently, we've undergone a restructure, and we've actually designed a whole team of colleagues around engagement and partnerships, because we see that as being a core part of our work. Before, that partnership work wasn't very visible, but now we have a core colleagues whose roles are named up to facilitate partnerships. And finally, this is a fairly obvious one, is that partnerships need to have objectives and measurable ways of knowing that they are of value. A partnership in and of itself is not of value unless it's actually delivering on something. But we need to understand that the partnership has objectives. So what are the objectives for the development of the partnership, as opposed to the objectives of the project that the partnership is advancing? And this is what I mean about that distinction between the partnership and the project. So I'm just going to pause for a minute, because it's often a good time to pause, and sometimes silence doesn't mean people don't know, it just means that we want to think. Just to give you 30 seconds to just reflect on the partnerships that you've experienced and how you might rate them on some of the principles that I've talked about. Which ones are most evident? Which ones are less evident? So I'm just going to pause for 30 seconds and just give you a chance to think, and then we'll move on to the next stage of the presentation. Okay. Mightn't have quite been 30 seconds, but that'll do our best. So, as I said, partnerships are often built not on a basis of equality. It's been very rare that a partnership that I've worked in where the partners have been exactly equal in terms of the knowledges, the resources, and the power that they bring to. But there is an expectation of this commitment. And that we are working towards everyone achieving some benefit from the work that we do. And you may be familiar with the notion of developing social capital. And this is, in fact, what a lot of partnerships are obviously attempting to do. This is something that we need to think about, that it's about actually building that foundation, saying this is what we intend to do. But the degree to which a partnership is going to be successful is obviously going to depend on a number of key things, like how autonomous are the partners in being able to make decisions? How much monitoring and regulation of a partnership is there? And how do we actually really genuinely build trust and collaboration, often with partners that are very diverse. When we were working with the very large infrastructure company that was building the light rail, a School of Education had never partnered with somebody like that before. It was very different cultures. You could imagine the cultures being vastly different. And so building that partnership to find that common ground, and the common ground that we found was the passion we have for educating children and young people about all of the wonderful and exciting opportunities there are in advanced manufacturing, in the advancements around transport, and in the design of public facilities. And the excitement that we knew this could bring to maths and science, but also to history lessons. And so we found this common ground, and then from two very different and disparate positions were able to come together to build and work with schools to use this fantastic infrastructure project as a vehicle for student learning. So I think one of the things that I'd like to spend on now is to actually sort of walk you through the sorts of reflections that I take school colleagues and other colleagues or organisations that I'm working with when we're reflecting on our partnerships. It's not enough to know what they look like. We actually need to be able to, in some concrete ways, think through what do they need to operate like. And what I'm going to share with you is some work that was done by the Nuffield Institute out of the University of Leeds. And what they did was develop a really useful tool to help organisations to assess the quality of their partnership relationships as a way of improving partnerships. And so I'm just going to sort of walk you quickly through that to give you an opportunity. So this is about, I guess, reframing those principles that we talked about in a fairly sort of theoretical way in a little bit more of a concrete type of way. So the first thing as a partnership is actually partly thinking about ourselves, but also sharing with our future partner about what it is that we look like. So this is about us knowing what we're like as a partner. Where have we had success and failure, and sharing that. Asking questions like, what does a successful partnership look like? So that we have an understanding that we're shooting for the same thing. What are going to be some of the barriers to us working together in the partnership? What are the restrictions or limitations that you have? The extent to which sometimes a partnership may not be voluntary. Sometimes it may be something that we have to do because neither of us is going to succeed unless we do it. And so we need to understand where those interdependencies are, as I've explained before. And we also need to understand too that if we're in a partnership, it doesn't mean we do everything together. It also means that we can take individual as well as collective responsibility. So what do we need to do individually as well as together to be able to then advance the goals of this project for which we formed this partnership? So that's a sort of an important sort of basic conversation that we often will have with our partners when we're starting out. Then we have to test the idea that is a partnership really the best vehicle or way of doing this? And this is where we actually then had to say, is what we're talking about realistic? Is it something that we can really do together in this partnership? Because if we can't find that shared vision, if we can't come to an agreement around common goals and that the partnership is possible or being able to do that, then a partnership may not be the answer to what we're trying to do. And I think very often, sometimes people pursue partnerships because they're nice and, this is what everybody does, when in actual fact, the wiser thing to do is to say, this partnership is not going to work. We actually need to step back because this is not going to be beneficial for you and it's not going to be beneficial for us. So developing that common ground and that realism around what we can do together is really important. And that you could imagine that taking some really significant discussion with a partner. It's not something that you can do in 5 minutes. Okay, as I said, and I've said this probably in a number of different ways, partnerships don't grow out of thin air. And it's often important that partnerships are enshrined in agreements and that express the understandings so that we know the parameters in which we're working. And I think these agreements probably need to be built on the previous two sets of principles that I talked about, the idea of understanding yourself, but also being clear about what the goals of the partnership are, so that the agreements reflect that understanding and also the responsibilities. The next one is actually thinking about this. Whenever we talk about relationships, about partnerships, we hear about this word trust. And this is, the most self-evident, but also the most elusive of the sorts of things that we need to work on, I think. Because most of the successful partnerships that I've been involved in, trust has been at very, very high, and the partnerships that have failed have been where trust has been low. So it's fairly an obvious thing to say. But it's very often very easy in partnerships for territorial conflicts to arise, where we can have arguments about, well, whose job was it and who hasn't done that and why is this happening this way, or being defensive about how we're stewarding the resources that we have. But I think it's really important that we need to be very clear about why trust is important and constantly be asking ourselves, is it significant and high enough for us to take the risks that we want to take in order to make this partnership work well? And this is, again, there's very much about the communication and the engagement and the level of engagement we have with partners around this. But it's also built through simple things like acknowledging the contributions that each partner is making, saying that what they're doing is valued, ensuring that there is fairness in the way in which the work is organised and the conduct of the partnership, constantly being aware that the benefits are being shared in a way that reflects agreements and is respectful of the partners. And also I guess the time when trust is most tested is when you're in conflict and actually seeing if there's sufficient there to be able to resolve it. But it's also about making sure you've got the right people in the right place at the right time. Trust can't be built in a partnership if you have a revolving door of people constantly not being part of the partnership. That becomes very hard because people feel like they're on shifting ground. They're not quite sure who they're dealing with. So trust is built through the way you steward the resources, which leads me on to the next one, which is about the working relationships. Many of us can think of partnerships that are often very complex with layers and layers of governance. And committees, this committee reports to that committee, and this working group and that working group. In my experience, the partnerships that often I've been involved in that work well are really lean, very lean and elegant. The word I use is elegant in the way in which they're governed. And partnerships are also time limited. They're not ones that go on and on forever. They are limited to 2-3 years, to whatever the scope of time is that's needed. And they are also, that when we're talking about the working arrangements, we're clear about the processes and the outcomes and what we're working towards and who's going to be doing what. This is something often that comes quite, people will often go to this part of the partnership formation process first without doing some of the other things that I've talked about. How good of a partner, what sort of partnership do we need? Is a partnership the best way to do what we're going to do? They'll go straight to, well, how is it going to work? And that generally will often mean that sometimes that we can find we run into some speed bumps because we haven't actually established that foundation that's needed. And finally, the last one is a very obvious one, and one that's neglected a lot, is about monitoring, reflecting and learning from the partnership. Asking our partners, well, how do we know, how are we going to know when we're successful? How are we going to know that this partnership, not the project, is successful, this partnership is successful? And how are we going to then share what we've learned, the benefits, and share and disseminate the information that we've learned? And the other thing as well too is in partnerships, it's always important to celebrate successes, but also to review the partnership, that it just doesn't roll on from year to year to year. I've been working in some schools where they say very proudly, oh, I've had a partnership with this organisation for 10 years. And you say, well, what did you do in the first year that's different from now in the 10th year? And they'll say, oh, no, I think we're just doing the same. What's changed in your context? Oh, everything's changed. That's really interesting. Are you getting as much out of your partnership that you've got? Because you have perhaps neglected to think about how you can leverage off that partnership as circumstances change. So that monitoring, reflecting and learning becomes really, really important. So just looping back now, just for a minute onto this, what I said before about partnership pedagogy. Thinking about these partnerships that I've talked about, well, what do they enable? Well, they enable, say, an industry partner, as in our case, Parramatta Light Rail, to join with the School of Education at Western Sydney University to identify a unit or a unit of work that where we would be offering teachers professional learning around STEM related subjects in the curriculum for teachers who are working in primary schools and secondary schools. And so we were able to co-design what that unit of work would look like. We talked about the content. We talked about the sorts of activities and assessments we would be asking the teachers who are going to be delivering this learning in their classrooms. How would we know they were going to be successful? And then we would go through the process of developing the resources. And you could imagine drawing on different resources in the partnership. The companies that we were working with had industry experts, world leaders in building railways, in building public infrastructure. We were able to talk to them about how they could make the work that they do interesting and understanding for the children in the schools or the young adults that we were working with. And then when we moved into the co-delivery stage, this is when it got really exciting because we had excursions and we had internships and we had simulations being brought into the classrooms and models and all sorts of things where we were engaged together in doing that. And then we ended up then having the students perform their learning to a group of people from the company. They designed train stations, where the trains would stop, and they presented those. So that's just one example, and I could probably go on forever about the detail of that. But this type of engagement was enabled by a partnership that was very much grounded in a lot of the principles and questions, that framework of asking ourselves about how we do the sort of partnerships that enable this partnership pedagogy. And constantly, we're always aware of that. Now, you might want to say, well, why would a big infrastructure company want to form a partnership with a school of education to design curriculum to teach 7 or 8 year olds, math or science? Why would they want to do that? Well, there's a lot of reasons why, but one of the things that the most reason why is the sharing of their resources and knowledge. When we talk to our partners, they talk about they also talk about their opportunities to build their own capacity of their staff. Their staff who are involved in this project learned an awful lot from us, and we learned a lot from them. And it was also part of their social mission as well too. So this is a partnership where we were able to find that common ground, as I talked about, and then build a successful partnership of two apparently on the surface, very unlikely partners, but were built on a lot on the principles and ideas that build the partnership as well as build the project. So that's my contribution and my thoughts on why partnerships are so valuable, particularly when we're thinking about building employability. I don't personally believe that we can build employability without actually bringing more into our classrooms, more into our schools. But that also has implications for the way in which we prepare our teachers, because traditionally teachers have been taught that they are the authorities in their classroom and their classroom is their domain. Whereas what we're saying is we actually need to have teachers who have all of the abilities to assess and build partnerships in the ways that I've talked about today. And that there is a pedagogy that we can build around this, a pedagogy of partnership, but it requires a very different way of working. But the outcomes, for example, connections to employability, are really a strong vehicle for doing that. And we see this manifest in a whole lot of different ways, in inquiry-based learning, problem-based learning. A lot of these types of things are enhanced by partnership pedagogy, and they have at their core this idea of building employability, building the skills, the capabilities, the dispositions that people need to thrive in today's changing society. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Simons. If you agree, we can move on to the Q&A session. Okay, okay, perfect. Okay, so we were live on YouTube and we gathered some questions and also some comments. So some of our participants really highlighted that trust, mutual understanding, and knowing each other were essential features for successful partnerships. We also had a question from Amanpreet Kaur. He wants to know what are the challenges related to inclusion of partnership curriculum in the regular curriculum?
Really good question. The biggest challenge is the regular curriculum, because you know, if we're wanting to change the outcomes or what we can enable our schools to allow our young people to develop, we have to change the curriculum. Some of you may be familiar with the term the grammar of schooling. It's a very famous phrase that's been coined by people. And if you think about grammar, grammar structures the language. Well, the grammar curriculum is very much a part of the grammar of schooling. You know, it actually drives what teachers' work is. And curriculum is often lots of things, content that people need to cover, and assessments and assignments. The sort of partnership pedagogy disrupts that grammar and actually says, well, there are, in fact, while content is really important, there are other things that we need to do in order to develop this employability, as an example, or cultural awareness, or problem solving, or some of the other capabilities that are so important. I heard Celia talk about Industry 4.0. You know, they are critical capabilities, but we don't have a subject called, you know, cultural awareness. It's built across the curriculum. The challenge with what partnership pedagogy does is it actually disrupts the curriculum and actually makes it more visible and actually makes it more deliberate. Because one of the challenges with a lot of things like problem solving, cultural awareness, is we name them and we say they're important in curriculum. Yes, we want them to develop, but then we name them and then we hope they're developed. What something like partnership pedagogy does is that it creates spaces in the curriculum. The other thing too, I think, is in what we learned with the Parramatta Railway project that I was talking about, is we can still teach maths and science and cover the curriculum and do inquiry-based learning at the same time. You can do both. It's not an either or, but it's got to be done deliberately, carefully, and we have to do things differently. So it does disrupt some of that grammar of schooling. I hope that answers your question.
So basically you're saying that in our current world, like we're all globalized, I actually believe that our world is made of partnerships, of interactions, of like combinations of disciplines to understand our surroundings. So you would say for a school, for an institution to thrive, would you make it compulsory to have partnerships?
Well, at Western Sydney University, partnership pedagogy is a required part of all of the courses that we offer. So as you know, our university is what we call a self-accrediting university. So we have internal governance structures where a new course so if I as a Dean of Education want to offer a new course, I design the course and then it has to be subject to being assessed by my peers in the university. They have mandated that partnership pedagogy is a part of the way we do business at Western Sydney University. And we have to demonstrate when we go for accreditation of our courses inside our university, how partnership pedagogy will work. What does it look like? Now, it's very easy to do it in initial teacher education, where I do a lot of my work, because we couldn't produce teachers without our partners. It's essential. We can't do it on our own. We'd turn out very poor teachers if we didn't have that. But in some other disciplines, it can be really challenging. We also know if we want to build that employability that's so crucial, we actually need partners to help us to do that.
Yeah. But what about when partnerships are like the outcome of those is not so tangible? So I'm thinking like sometimes the partnerships can help for as you mentioned in your talk, like the people's capital, they might broaden their horizons, they might improve their mindset. But how do you convince your institution that you also need this kind of partnerships?
Look, I think it's about tying it to the outcomes that you need for in our case, our graduates, and illustrating the connection between what a partnership of a particular quality is going to be able to deliver. So it's joining those dots in a really systematic way, and trying as much as we can to say, this is the quality of the partnership we need. So this is what we need to invest in. We need to invest time, energy and resources in building this quality partnership that will then act as a vehicle to provide us with these outcomes for these students. Because the partnership is linked to actually saying we need a partnership of this particular type to drive this particular type of outcome. So it's trying to join that golden thread. That golden thread runs through things. But the challenge, I think, is to be as deliberate about partnership as we are about the project that we're wanting to achieve in the end. And those other things, those intangible things, sometimes Celia, they are really surprising. You know, we find that we are developed, we become better people, we become more engaged. You know, they're parts of the byproduct of a carefully stewarded, well-managed, well-understood partnership that is curated and cared for and built over time.
But it might be difficult to measure at times.
Oh, it is. You're absolutely right. For people who like to measure, partnerships are really slippery. You're absolutely right. There's no, it's difficult. And that's why people tend to ignore it. They just say, oh, yeah, everything will be fine. No worries, we'll just keep going. And often it's not until a partnership, hits a speed bump, where there's conflict or things start to go wrong, that people go, oh my goodness. And in my work, when I've worked with organisations, say, well, let's trace this back. And when they go back, they say, oh yeah, actually, we missed it. If we'd been paying attention to what was going on in the partnership then, we wouldn't have ended up where we were now. So that's why it's important to, I personally believe it's important to do both.
Yes. I don't know if our participants have any more questions.
Don't think so. They seem to be very very quiet. It must be the end. It must be because it's towards the middle of the day, or
Double check.
Well, I see that Dr. Anu Verma has raised the hand. If Dr. Anu Verma wants to ask
yes,
a question.
please.
Dr. Anu, can you unmute yourself?
Okay, we might wait a few minutes to see if Dr. Verma can actually join for a question. I also found very interesting in your talk that you mentioned the word permeability. Like, what does it mean exactly for an institutional, for someone to be permeable in this context?
Look, I think what it means is that is I use the term in that institutions need to be open to their communities or open to the wider world. In the area where I work and live in Western Sydney, there's a lot of thinking going on now about schools and how they need to be much more open to the communities. We have visions of schools, you know, with the fences around them and, you know, and students going through the front gate. There are now some beautiful new schools being built that have no gates and fences, that are community hubs where you might have aged care services alongside the school, where the students can walk down the road to go to the museum. So it's about this permeability, that not everything has to go on inside the organisation, that not, you know, that in actual fact the resources to achieve our goals lie outside in our partnerships with organisations and other people. So for many people that's a challenge. You know, people will say that permeability is, well, we can probably think of it as being essential, you know. For many people they say no, it's too much of a risk. You know, we need to be independent, or if we are too permeable, people will steal our ideas and we have to keep all our ideas to ourselves. So, you know, it's about that openness to willing to be influenced by others, but also realizing that, you know, as schooling becomes more complicated, as the world becomes more complicated, we need more resources. And while universities can be very rich, they don't contain everything that they need. And, you know, I certainly don't have everything I need to prepare the best teachers. I actually need the partners that I work with to prepare the very best teachers. And without them, we would fail in our job.
That's true. I mean, I think it's very important that schools are aware, as you said, that they cannot provide students with everything they need for the current societies. But it's very interesting. I never thought that actually the physical construction of a school could play a role, but it's true. It's not inviting to go somewhere with fences and yes, they act like isolated silos, like we're not part of the city, we're not part of the community.
There's a whole new science being built around this whole idea of architecture and space, and the idea that when a young person looks at a school or looks at a classroom, they can see, if they don't see things that are familiar to them, or they see things that they think, oh yeah, that relates to me, they can feel really alienated in schools. And so there's all this science now about how do we use space and build buildings so that people can say, yeah, I belong here. This is a place for me.
So I don't know the situation in Australia, but would be public schools better at this than private ones, or no distinction actually?
Oh, look, public schools often suffer from a lack of funding. Many governments are investing heavily in public infrastructure, and in New South Wales, they're building some beautiful new schools. There's a very large multi-billion-dollar investment in improving the quality of schools in New South Wales, and there's a fantastic website called the Schools Infrastructure New South Wales website, where you can go on and see all the beautiful buildings that are being done. So there's investment, but often it's the schools that are rich and wealthy that will have the better resources. And then some of the poorer schools in some of the poorer communities will not have very much at all. And it's often just a make do, people make do with what they've got. It varies enormously. And there are some schools that, they look very sad, and it's challenging for the children to say, I want to go to school every day. I mean, we wouldn't like to be in an awful environment. We like pleasant, nice environments that are inviting to us. Children are no different. Yes. they want to be in a place that they feel good about.
We have one last question from our YouTube chat. So this question comes from Rajbir Kaur. Do you see any obstacle in building partnerships in the education system?
Yes, there's lots of obstacles. Lots of obstacles. I mean, Celia, the point you and the other point being made before, that sometimes people will say, schools are there to educate young people, and that's what we do. We follow the curriculum, and a lot of this stuff is just distraction. And so, convincing people that the need for partnerships, the need and the value that they can bring, sometimes it's as fundamental as that. I think also it's partnerships take time, and in this really busy, time compressed world, we've just, it's just easier if we just do it ourselves, or all this effort that's got to go into building these partnerships. We don't need that. We just get on and do it. So I think there are lots of barriers, but I think there are also lots of benefits. And as I said before, it's important. Partnerships aren't the answer to everything. It's a bit like, if you know the world of human resources, a lot of people will say, training is the answer to everything. Well, no, it's not. Sometimes the answer is to change the team, to move people on, and then you get the outcome. And so, partnerships are not always the answer. So part of the challenge is actually saying, is a partnership the right vehicle to achieve what we want? And then the challenge is to say, are we prepared to invest in the type of partnership we need to get the mutual benefits and to achieve all of those things that I think are so important as part of a partnership.
I see. It's important to know what the problem is, not to answer that partnership is the solution.
That's so right. We can become partnership junkies.
Exactly. So we have Dr. Verma back, and we have the question, which is, every year, the number of students achieving higher education is increasing. How can partnerships facilitate the enhancement in the employability skills?
I think there's a lot of things that we can do, and I think we're starting to see those things. What's happening here is the boundary between school and university is becoming more blurred. That building of employability for young people can start even before they leave school. And schools do a lot of work in building employability, in the ways they can organise the curriculum, and that the Parramatta Light Rail was an example of a school that's concerned with and interested in building employability and exposing young people to fantastic, exciting future careers. And And so what then needs to happen is that needs to continue on. One of the interesting things about education is that if schools change, universities have to change. And sometimes there's always an interesting debate about who moves more quickly, schools or universities. And I think sometimes some of the schools are more forward moving and faster moving than some of the universities. But then there's children and young people who are graduating from schools and coming into our universities and our colleges and our vocational institutions are used to that type of approach. So they are also looking for it and expecting it as well too. So the idea is that as societies, I think, demand different things. You know, what we want our schools and our university to do is changing. It's not the same. And as those demands change, then we change in response to that. And I think pedagogy, partnership pedagogy and inquiry-based learning and a lot of these curriculum innovations that we're seeing are in part this response to education systems saying we need to think differently about what society is asking us to do in terms of the outcomes from education. And employability is one of the big asks at the moment. Cultural awareness is another really big one. And so we have to, as a social institution, respond. And I think as schools change, universities are changing. As universities produce professionals who are changing, they feed back. So you get into this, but it's not it's a very bumpy process. But it goes, for me, it goes to the core of why we exist. We exist to serve a purpose in our community, and the communities are demanding different things of us and different things of our graduates. So we need to listen, otherwise we become irrelevant.
It's interesting. We actually have partners in our EDUREFORM projects. Some are universities and some are schools, and we can see the difference in thinking and the different approaches, and it's very interesting. But I think, yes, this might be it for the Q&A session. Well, I'll thank you very much, Dr. Simons, for answering all of our questions. I'll give the floor to Alda, who will do the vote of thanks.
Thank you. Thank you again, Dr. Simons. It was really an insightful session, and especially because as we presented our project, it is about, we work in partnership. We are a partnership of 11 partners, which is not only Indian partners, so it's European partners. So this building trust is very important to us. Also, I like the co-pedagogy, the concept of co-pedagogy partnership, which is what we are trying to do also, because what we will do is building curricula all together among the partners. This is one of the objectives of our project. So we really appreciate you for this lecture. It is very important when you mentioned all the elements of the trust, and to give equally, to recognize the efforts of the partners, and not just to meet for successes, but to meet and to talk. It takes time, but it's helpful for the success of the project, because sometimes we forget about the partnership. So we focus mainly of what the objectives are, but we forget that to reach those objectives, we need to have a successful partnership. So this is very helpful for us, and I guess for everyone who attended. So I want to again thank you for this amazing lecture. And I would also like to thank Mr. Namrata Anand, Mr. Sanjeev Sani, and Mr. Vani Parvez, and all the other panelists and all the attendees today who attended the lecture. Thank you again, Dr. Simons. And
thank you. If anyone would like information about partnership pedagogy, you have my email. Just send me an email and I can share. I'm very happy to share resources and information with anything you've heard today that you think you might be of interest. Just give me an email and I will share happily.
Thank you. Yes, we we will ask maybe some suggestions if being a partnership we might need. Do they exist? I don't know, some kind of trust exercises that we might use among our partners. This will be maybe helpful to us.
Whatever.
So
That's
thank
good.
you again. Thank you again, Dr. Simons. Thank you to everyone, and see you. Have a nice day.
Thank
And
you.
nice afternoon, I guess, in Australia. It's already evening, or I guess.
Thank you, Alda. Professor Simon, can I ask you to hold on for one moment, and I'll ask our system administration to just exit all the participants. And thank you, participants,